What's this, episode 13? Episode 13.
Sí.
See what you practicing your Spanish
Sí.
now. Para es. No, I'm just
Uno,
playing.
dos, tres,
Listen.
cuatro,
Listen.
cinco,
She.
seis, siete, ocho, nueve, diez,
Diez.
ocho,
Ocho.
cinco, ocho,
Diez. Once.
diez, once, diez.
No.
No.
Diez is 10.
Diez,
Once.
once.
Doce.
I don't know how to say episode in Spanish, but here we are.
Episoda.
Episodio. Episodio.
Listen. We'll be back right after this for the next episode of Behind Closed Doors.
With the Brookses.
Oh, Roy. That's not how you say it.
The Brookses.
The Brookses.
The Brookses.
Sis. Rolling camera?
Yes.
Oh, snap. All right, here we go in 3, 2, 1. All right, guys, we are back for another episode of Behind Closed Doors. We are back, obviously, coming to you guys from the deck of our pool, hanging out here in El Cangrejo, Panama. And we're going to talk to you about
Expectations versus reality, the marriage edition.
So, Cherie, a lot of times I know for us, we fall into this trap like everybody else. And particularly when it comes to communicating, a lot of times we are communicating what is an expectation for us, but turns out to be a reality for the other. So what I mean versus what I say, or what I mean to do versus what I do. That's the reality. Sometimes I don't mean it to come out that way, but the reality is it did. Can we talk a little bit about how that looks in relationships, particularly in marriage?
Okay, and so when it comes to expectations, we have to be honest and recognize that oftentimes our expectations are not communicated to our spouse. And so when it comes to communication, so I'll just use you as an example. You came from a family of talkers. You came from, I won't necessarily say it's the most healthy communication, but at least they communicated.
Right.
They did talk. And so your expectation when we got together was that I would talk, that I would talk about things, that we would have
Deep, meaningful communication.
deep, meaningful conversation. So
And that wasn't the case.
that was not the reality. So when we were friends first before we started dating. So when we were friends, yes, we would talk. We would have conversations about things, but we could have those surface type conversations. We could have conversations about the things that we liked, we didn't like. The problem came up when there were actually issues to be talked about, because your expectation was because I was talking freely about other things, we could sit and we could sit up for hours and talk. We could go out and have coffee and talk about this, that, and the other, that I could do that easily. But when it came to issues, the reality came to head that I had a challenge with confrontation.
Right.
I had a problem with dealing with issues, with having those hard conversations, because I did not come from a background of people that communicated.
When you say that, a lot of times I think that, and you taking me back, because I remember clearly thinking, well, it's easy for us to have hours worth of meaningless conversation. Why can't we have hours worth of meaningful conversation? Well, the truth is, when it's meaningful, sometimes it's confrontational.
Right. And so your expectation was that we would have those deep conversations. For me, I was accustomed to hiding. I was accustomed to, because I had been pretty much on my own most of my adult life. Even though I had been married before, I was really pretty much self-sufficient even in those previous relationships. So I was used to me just handling things, me fixing it on my own, me not having to have a conversation.
Right.
I'm not going to talk to you about it. I'm going to just fix it. I'm going to do whatever I got to do to fix the situation.
That's saying what's understood doesn't need to be said.
Right. I got this. I don't need to tell you how I'm going to handle it, or I don't need
because it's already understood. But my question was always, is it?
Right.
What, is it really understood?
Right, and the challenge with that was when I had a problem, I couldn't come to you and share with you something that I disagreed with, or that I was, not feeling if there was a certain situation going on and I wasn't completely in agreement with it, or I had my feelings hurt, it was hard for me to have those conversations with you because my expectation on the flip side was that if I'm walking around with an attitude, you should know something's wrong.
Let's start there.
You should know that what you did bothered me.
How many times,
I shouldn't have to have that conversation.
How many times, fellas, where you'll walk in the house and you haven't been there all day? Maybe she got there an hour, 2 hours before you did. Maybe y'all worked different shifts. She was home all day and you weren't, or vice versa. But the bottom line is you come into a room and there's been thoughts that have been going through your wife's head only for you to walk into this situation that you don't know is a situation. And now there's this expectation on your part, well, clearly you know what's going on in my head. What's
Right.
the problem with that, babe?
Well, I don't. Back then, I would have said there wasn't a problem because you should know. But
Ooh.
the truth is, I'm expecting you to be a mind reader. I'm expecting you to read the temperature in the room and know that something's gone left, and for you to just figure it out on your own.
Got it.
Which is not fair.
Got it.
But for me, because many times the issues that were problems for me were things that, in my mind, were things that you should know anyway. And so
that's and even that, it's funny, you laugh because I know you're probably thinking about some tense situations where we will go on full tangents based on what you think somebody should know. Like everybody does this, or
Right.
everybody
How do
thinks
you
this
not-
way, or how do you
What?
not think that way? And it's crazy to me. So I think before we move on, one of the things that you've got to come to the conclusion of is that if the expectation is never communicated, if the expectation is never laid out, then you're going to always miss each other when it comes to fulfilling said expectation. If my expectation is that when I come home, I'd like an hour to decompress, but I want to talk about your day in detail. Like, I want to know what happened, and you're the kind of person that doesn't like to talk in details, then that expectation needs to be put on the table, and then there needs to be some sort of middle ground that we come to in order to be able to meet in the middle.
Right, and so it's very easy to say, yes, the expectations to be communicated. So how do you communicate that expectation? Because many times expectations that we have in a relationship don't arise until that situation arises. So
True.
It's not like you have this list when you come into the relationship.
Right.
These are my expectations
Right.
that I'm going to sit down with you and
Right.
go through. And so in order to be able to communicate your expectations, when those situations arise, that's when to have that conversation. That's when to share with your partner that, hey, I noticed that, when you come home from work, you go straight into your office or you go out in the backyard and decompress. I would like it if when you came home, yes, you can have some time to decompress, but can we at least have a quick conversation, a check-in, and then you'd be like, okay, give me 30 minutes. You communicate that that's what you're going to do versus you come in, you walk in the door, hey, how you doing? And then you just keep it moving and you never say anything.
And that was my MO.
Right.
Like, I never communicated to you clearly that I need some time to decompress. And to be fair, and that's why I think it's important for us to help y'all understand, we know that this doesn't come up until the time it starts happening. But the challenge is in the middle of it happening, there's often not a conversation.
Right.
So therefore, if I go to my office, as soon as I get in the house, I change my clothes, I go to my office, and I decompress, whatever that looks like. At that particular point, what happens is now you're left feeling like, what's up? Like, what's going on with me? You begin to fill in blanks. When if there was a conversation about why I do this, or that this was or that you you had a problem with that.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? And I think that that's something that we had to learn real fast, because that was a real situation for us.
Right. And I think that also when those situations come up, having the conversation not in crisis, not after you got an attitude.
Right.
Have the conversation when you first realize, hey, this is not what I was expecting.
Right.
So saying, hey, I was expecting when you came home. And then this is the other part. We have to remember that we're two individuals and that we both have different expectations. We both have different mindsets when it comes to certain things. And this is where grace comes into the relationship. Because so one particular area for us particularly has been household chores, household tasks, things to be done. Early on in our relationship, we still had kids in the house and I did everything. I set the tone that I was going to clean, I was going to cook, I was going to do all these things. As we've gotten older, we're empty nesters now. My expectation has changed, but I had not communicated that to Glenn. So he was accustomed to me doing everything, and I did it. You know, the kids had some chores, they had things today to do, but for the most part, I handled everything. I would come home from work, I would cook, I would clean, you know, I would handle those things, but that's because that was something that I wanted to do. It wasn't ever something that, you know, we had sat down and said, this is going to be your role.
Right.
This is going to be your role.
Right.
But I had set the tone for that, and this is where I had to be honest with myself. When you set the tone for something, when you have created a pattern of doing something
That's
different,
good.
it's on you to have the conversation when that changes.
Right.
You can't just assume that the other person knows that you no longer want to do this, or you no longer don't want to do this. And so their expectation is that you've always done that, so why would they expect something differently?
I know we got some other things on the list, Cherie, but I want to move on really quickly. Before we do, let me ask y'all a question. What are some expectations that you came into your marriage with that just went unmet? Like you thought, I remember dating a young lady one time that said, well, that's what men do. And my father always did this, that, and the third. And so my expectation is that you would do the same thing, when the truth is I'm not her father.
Right.
And so, or nor did I, you know, necessarily think like he did as a man. I think, unfortunately, what challenges people is that they either A, don't know what it is, or B, if they do, they don't know how to communicate it. What are some challenges? Put it in the chat. I'd love to hear from you guys on the things that you thought earlier on in marriage. No, this is what I need from them. This is the expectation. But it really wasn't communicated, if you're honest. Put it in the chat.
Right, and so I don't want to beat a dead horse, but one thing real quick I want to go over. So one particular area where expectations always get crossed is when it comes to gender roles. And this is where we have to be honest and looking at who our partner is, not just what their gender is. And what I mean by that is statements like that, well, all men do that, or all women do that. You know, if a man comes into the relationship and he's expecting you to be barefoot and pregnant, and that's not who you are.
I'm going to need you to be barefoot and pregnant, shorty.
You would be offended.
Listen.
You would be like, what the heck are you
no
talking about?
No shoes in this house.
Right. But we will very freely, for women, be like, you know what, this is what a man is supposed to do. And I think we have to look at marriage as a partnership. It's where you both bring your strengths together and you work together. You complement one another. And so I'm not going to expect you to do something that I realize that's not your strength, or not an area that you're an expert in, if I want it done in a certain way. And so I think we have to extend grace into relationships. So to move on, another area in particular that expectations can get crossed also is when it comes to you having your own leisure time, or you guys spending time apart. I think sometimes, and this really happens more so I think in younger couples than older couples, but you get married and you think y'all supposed to be together, y'all supposed to spend every waking moment together. That every time you move, I move. Like that. When you move, I move. Just like that. That's...
Hey, listen, you don't want me singing the rest of that song.
No.
Listen, I'm telling you right now, and Cherie, I think I remember having friends, you know, you and I have been married 25 years. I was married 12 years before that. That's 37 years of my adult life I've been married. When I got married the first time, I'm 19 years old, 20 years old. And I remember some young couples like us who had got married, or like my ex-wife and I who got married with us. And there was this thing of, we were all going to the same church, and when you see them in church, you know, they all hugged up and this, that, and the third, and he couldn't move without her being right there. And if he breathed, if he inhaled, she exhaled. And I remember thinking, I remember thinking, that's weird. There was nothing cute about that. And I think that had to do with an expectation of what marriage is. And so a lot of times people think that my job is to complete you.
We become one.
We become physically one person.
We're one.
You get what I'm saying? It's like, I really don't think that that's what that is. And I think that what it does is it creates room for people to feel smothered.
Right.
And for people to feel like, wait a minute, I cease to be an individual.
Right.
Like, what's that about? Where does that come from? I mean, particularly, and I think a lot of times, if I'm honest, I see this a lot more in women than men, where there's this need for him to always be there,
Well,
versus a man who tends to not be that one. Now, and I know that's not always, so don't come for me, but I'm just saying. But can you tell me, where does that come from?
I think a lot of it comes from immaturity. I think a lot of it comes from not knowing yourself. I think it's, like I said, oftentimes what happens is that when we're in relationships, especially when we're younger, that person becomes our all, our end all.
Yeah.
They become our everything. And when that happens, the danger of that, the unhealthiness of that is that you isolate yourself. And so you become isolated, you become an island unto yourselves, just the two of you, and you don't continue to further develop outside of the relationship.
We talked about that on the last episode. That personal development never takes place because you're never alone long enough to personally develop.
Right. So when you come together and in a relationship, you may have some mutual interests, but you should have other interests, other things outside. I mean, if you think about it, you go to two separate jobs if you both work outside the home. So you have something separate. So there's a separation that should happen, and you guys should come back together at the end of the day every day. I think it's extremely unhealthy when you become so engrossed in just your relationship that that's your end all be all. You don't have any outlets, you don't have any friends that you spend time with, you don't have your own hobbies or interests that you do. It becomes unhealthy because, like I said, you become attached to each other and it skews your perspective because you're not able to, it closes your world perspective.
Got it.
Where now your whole world is just what's going on in your house. It's just between you. And so you're limiting your access to wisdom. You're limiting your access to personal growth because it's just what the two of you are exchanging, and you're not opening yourself up to anything else.
The thing I wanted you, and I want to touch on this a little bit because we see this oftentimes in the people we coach, you find that level of immaturity breeds this insulation thing. So in other words, you become insulated within the capsule of y'all. And that's where that us four and no more, what goes on in this house stays in this house. There's no introduction of anything outside. And I think that shows its ugly head often when it's crisis.
Right.
So for example, if you never have a differing of perspectives, typically speaking, when you disagree, it becomes a major issue because you're supposed to agree all the time, or you're used to being in agreement all the time, and you don't even know what that feels like in order to be to disagree agreeably or to agree to disagree, and it becomes this all-out thing. And I think a lot of that comes from this unhealthy attachment. I do want to kind of briefly touch on this notion that seems to be prevalent in the world, and that is this idea of rolling with your girls, him rolling with his guys, and you having adult friends that are of the opposite sex when it comes to opening up your circle. So if we're saying to people that the way you overcome this level of independence or this level of dependence on one another is to develop circles. Right? How should those circles be made up, in your opinion, in terms of building a healthy marriage? And I don't want to go forever on this, but give me a couple of things.
So I think that there's a very fine line between having friends of the opposite sex. And I think that I personally don't, well, I'll say this. I do have friends that are of the opposite sex, but they are friends that are mutual friends. I don't have a male friend that Glenn does not know, that I go out and hang out with without him knowing, without him, having any connection with this person. And it's not someone that, most of my male friends have been people that we met together, or they were your friends first in many cases. Meaning you may have known him first and then I got to know him through mutual contact with them. But I think that, the issue with having friends of the opposite sex has nothing to do with, and this is this is a double-edged sword I'm getting ready to go down. It has nothing to do with your spouse being insecure if they don't want you to have a friend of the opposite sex. The reason being, there are certain things, when you talk about a friend, let's talk about friend. A true friend is somebody that you should be able to share with, you should be able to confide in. I have no business confiding in another man about anything that's going on with me emotionally, anything going on relationally. I should not be confiding those things with another man unless it's somebody mutually that we know and it's a trusted person, like I'm going to them for maybe spiritual advice.
Or a counselor.
Or someone like that.
Somebody like that. And why?
The reason is because it can get very convoluted. It can cross some boundaries.
Right.
And it's playing too close to boundaries. Now, you can have associates that you have, relationships with of the opposite sex. But when we look at the true definition of a friend, and when you're calling, because oftentimes I hear, people talking about, well, my best friend is a man, or my best friend, your best friend is the person that you really confide in.
Right.
And that's where I think that it gets dangerous when you're putting this other person on this level that your spouse should be on.
That part.
That's where the challenge comes in.
Now, I want to sort of add to that a little bit. I'll set you up a little bit, and I know I threw that one at you without you really knowing that it was coming. And the reason why is because we're talking about expectations and reality. A lot of times when you get married, if you have been in college and high school, if you may have entered the workforce as a single person in your early 20s or whatever, you may have developed relationships with the opposite sex. You may have that person that you grew up with since third grade and y'all rock like that and that sort of stuff. But generally speaking, if that is in fact the case, when you meet your significant other, that friend is not far. Mm-hmm. That friend is not far behind. That friend is not something that's a person that's disassociated with your significant other later becoming your spouse. I think that that's different because in a lot of ways, there's no introduction, there's no getting to meet that person, there's no nothing because you've introduced a person that your ex or your spouse knows nothing about. And I think that's what Cherie is talking about. I think that the challenge becomes when you have these unhealthy affections for someone during a crisis period, and now instead of giving the energy that you should be giving to your spouse, you're finding that you're giving this energy to a best friend. And I'm going to take it a step further. I quite frankly think that there is a significant argument to be made for how intimate you should be with even the same sex more so than your spouse.
Yes.
And the reason why is because I think that all those serve to chip away or erode at the foundation of y'all's relationship. Now, I know a lot of people might come for me on this, and I have found, and again, you're talking about somebody who was married for 37 years of his life. In my first marriage, it's no secret, the reason we're divorced is partly because of my indiscretions and the series of them. And I'm not going to get into all of that. That's for a whole nother talk. But the truth of the matter is that I could promise you I had friends that were of the opposite sex that started out as friends, but because I am divulging my innermost secrets to, it becomes more than that. And now I find myself detaching. And that's the kind of stuff I just think you set yourself up for stuff that just doesn't have to be when you begin to do that.
Right. And so I'm going to just take a leap here. So most affairs, well, I won't say most, I'll say 99% affairs start basically from a conversation. It's you're confiding in somebody. You're sharing with somebody something that you don't feel like you can share with your spouse. They understand you. They hear you. That's how most affairs start. Most affairs don't start, you just meet somebody and y'all go have sex.
Right.
Let's be honest. Most affairs, it starts as an emotional attachment. And so when you're confiding in a friend of the opposite sex, you're putting yourself in a position for there to become an emotional attachment.
That part.
That should not be there. And so, yes, you may have been friends since y'all was 10 years old. That's fine. But there are certain conversations you shouldn't be having with that friend. There are certain conversations that are intimate conversations that you should only be having with your spouse. And that's where it gets tricky when people are talking about, my best friend is this male or his best friend is a female.
Right.
When you start putting labels on people as best friend, there's an automatic expectation. When you say somebody is your best friend, that means that the expectation is that you're going to be confiding in them, that they're there for you. That's your ride or die.
Right.
That's the person that you can go to in any situation and share everything with. if that's not what you mean when you're referring to your friend of the opposite sex, you need to just simply refer to them as a friend.
Right.
The challenge comes in when you start giving people labels and you start, because what happens is that, so if I were to come to Glenn and say, well, you know, John over here is my best friend. We've been best friends forever. How you gonna have a problem with him being my best friend? And now I'm defending the relationship with my friend
Over the relationship.
with my spouse. If
That's
my
a problem.
spouse has a problem with me having such an intimate relationship, such a close relationship with the person, I made a commitment to this person.
That part.
And my friend should understand if I need to pull back from the relationship for the sake of my marriage.
Cherie, I want to jump in really quickly, and I know we got a couple other things that we want to talk about, and I opened up Pandora's box on this one. I want y'all to check in the comments. Like, what are y'all's opinions on this? What are your thoughts? Because I think that in many cases, Cherie, what I am finding is that people are robbing their spouses of the best of them.
Yes.
I robbed my ex-wife of the best of me. In other words,
Right.
if I were to take those feelings that I had and thoughts that I had and
And
words that I needed to
share it
say,
with her.
and I learned to share them with her, I would have affair-proof my marriage.
Right.
Without a doubt. And I think that the problem is that we don't give our spouses, and I hear Charlene Hawkins in my head. George Hawkins' wife said something to me, some great friends of ours. We were just talking. We might have been doing a podcast a while back. And she said that I think that, you know, spouses need to prefer one another.
Right.
And I think that one of the things is that demonstrates when I have all this conversation for anybody else,
Right.
and I'm just not even going to put that on the opposite sex.
Any
if I'm
friend.
coming into the house 4, 5, 6 days a week, and she's on the phone for an hour to 2 hours to 3 hours
With somebody else.
talking to her mother,
Right.
I don't care who it is.
Right. I'm preferring her over you.
What you're saying is I prefer whoever I'm talking to over you.
Right. And that's not.
You cannot tell me with a straight face that that's not going to erode at the confidence of that relationship. If nothing else, it robs you of time.
Right.
And I think that that's the thing that I'm probably dealing with more than anything else.
Right.
The time that I'm taking away from you
Right.
and giving to this, I have to audit that.
Right. And so we're talking about expectations versus reality. The expectation when you get married is that your spouse is going to be that person that you can confide in. Your spouse is going to be your friend. Your spouse is going to be that person that when you got to work stuff through, you're going to work that through with them. The reality, unfortunately, for many couples is that there's someone outside that the spouse is going to. So like Glenn said, whether it's a friend that's of the opposite sex, whether it's your parent, whether it's a sibling, whether it's anybody else, you should always prefer your spouse over those individuals. And whenever you're preferring someone outside of the relationship, you're setting yourself up for problems in your relationship because it's chipping away at the foundation of your relationship. Is chipping away at your friendship. It's chipping away at the intimacy in your marriage.
Yeah.
It's chipping away at the trust in your marriage, because if I'm confiding in my mother things that are going on in my relationship, there's a trust issue here, because you're going to feel like I can't, anything that goes on with us, that I'm going to go run and tell somebody else. So
Absolutely.
that's chipping away at
Absolutely.
our trust. And so the expectation should be when you get married that this person that I'm marrying, that I'm saying till death do us part, through sickness and health, till, you know, through richer or poorer, that this is the person that I'm saying that I want to share myself, I want to share life with. And so for me to share myself, that means sharing those intimate conversations with this person. And so that's the expectation, but we have to look at, in reality, is that's what's really going on in our relationship.
And if it's not, how do we get to the reality part? Because here's what I hear some
How
of
do
you
we
guys
change the
saying.
reality?
I hear some of y'all saying, yeah, but I don't trust my spouse like that. I don't like my spouse like that. I'm not friends with my spouse like that. My spouse will run and tell that. Now, that to me, at this particular point, if you can say that, now what that says is still prefer your spouse, but now from a standpoint of we got work to do.
Right.
Let me say this, Cherie. I want to have a conversation with you first about the things that are closest to my heart. But right now, I don't feel like that we're in a space where I even want to do that. I'd like to figure out, how do we work on that? I want to increase my desire to want to talk to you. Can we talk about how we can create a safe space so that I feel absolutely like I can share anything with you and it's not going to come back on me?
Right. And
I'm role playing that on purpose, and I need everybody to understand that's how that conversation should go, y'all.
Right.
As opposed to, now bump that. I'm gonna go talk to my guy, my buddy, or I'm gonna talk to my sister. In my case, you know, I have 7 sisters. Trust me when I tell you,
you could talk to them.
there's a lot of ladies I can talk to long before I step out, but it's not fair, because at this particular point, it doesn't do anything to help build our nurture our relationship.
Right, and that actually, you know, is a great segue. And I think that one thing we have to look at when we're in relationships, when we're in marriage, is that, you know, we should be preferring our spouse, but we also, when it comes to expectations and honoring each other's expectations and making that reality match our expectations, we have to create a safe space. I have to be safe for him. He has to be safe for me, so that we can come to each other, so that we can share in those things, so we can have those conversations about those tough issues. We can have the conversations when things are icky. We can actually talk, but that's creating a safe space. And so you have to learn how to have safe conversations. You have to learn the rules of engagement, and that's something we'll probably talk about in our next episode, but you have to be willing to do that work. It takes work. None of us grew up this way. None of us naturally communicate this way. None of us have, you know, you may have been married 5, 10, 15 years. We've been married 25 years. We're still figuring this out.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
But it takes work, and
It
we've
does.
committed to doing the work.
Speaking of that, I can't let that go by saying, for those of you guys, if you watch this in time enough, Cherie and I are going to be launching a 6-week course inside of our Marriages and Parenting Successfully Relationship Academy that will allow you to come in and to do work around these kinds of tools. Here's what I'm going to submit to you. Everyone believes that communication is key in a relationship, but the challenge becomes, do you know how? Do you know what? And do you know when to communicate? Many people are lost when it comes to the skills of communication, and that's some of the stuff that you're going to get in this workshop. So if you click the link in the description, you'll find a little bit about how you can sign up for that, and hopefully it will be before that takes place when you see this.
And if you've missed that workshop, you'll also find the link where you can schedule a free discovery session with us, so that we can discuss with you what we do in our Master Relationship Academy and bring you up to date on any upcoming events. We do these events regularly. We always have something going on, adding value to couples. And so we hope to see you in that room. But for now,
here's what we know to be true. At the end of the day, you can't get to any place of significance by yourself, guys. Why? Because we all need some help. Y'all be good, and we'll see you on the next episode of Behind Closed Doors.